3 drunk men circled the royal guard, taunting him, daring him to react, pushing every boundary they could. Crowds watched. Security stood frozen. Then they went too far. From within the crowd, an 11-year-old boy stepped forward. But this wasn't just any child, it was Prince George. He spoke just one line, and in an instant, the men shrank, their arrogance crushed under the weight of a child's words. But when one of them reached toward him, that's when the guard finally moved. Before we show you how centuries of discipline snapped into action, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, its rays filtering through the ancient trees that had witnessed centuries of British history. It was one of those perfect autumn days that London rarely offers. Crisp air, clear skies, and the kind of light that makes even the most mundane scene look like a painting. But what was about to unfold in front of those famous black iron gates would be anything but mundane. Guardsman Michael Thompson stood at his post with the kind of military precision that had been drilled into him through months of rigorous training. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat positioned at exactly the regulation angle, and his SA-80 rifle held in the precise manner that had been perfected over generations of royal guards. To the hundreds of tourists who passed by each day, he was little more than a living statue, a colorful addition to their holiday photos and Instagram posts. But Thompson was far more than ceremonial decoration. Beneath that famous red uniform lay the hardened body of a combat veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the SAS before being selected for the honor of guarding the royal family. The transition from special forces to ceremonial duties had been challenging, trading the adrenaline-fueled chaos of counter-terrorism operations for the disciplined stillness of palace guard duty required a different kind of mental toughness. What the public didn't know, what they could never know, was that Thompson's assignment to Buckingham Palace wasn't purely ceremonial. His SAS background made him part of an elite cadre of guards who served dual purposes, maintaining the traditional pageantry that tourists expected while providing genuine close protection for the royal family. His service record was classified at the highest levels, sealed away in files that detailed operations in places that didn't officially exist on any military map. From his position at the gate, Thompson had a clear view of the palace's main courtyard and the family quarters beyond. It was from one of those upper windows that 10-year-old Prince George often watched the changing of the guard, his young face pressed against the glass as he observed the precise choreography of military tradition. Thompson had noticed the boy's fascination with the guards during his 6 months at this posting, the way George would study their movements and try to mimic their bearing when he thought no one was looking. The afternoon had been relatively quiet by palace standards. The usual stream of tourists had passed by, taking their photographs and marveling at the spectacle of British pageantry. A few had tried the traditional attempts to make Thompson smile or flinch, silly faces, loud noises, even attempts at conversation, but he had remained as motionless as the bronze statues that adorned the palace facade. The first sign of trouble came at exactly 3:47 p.m. when Thompson's trained ear picked up the sound of raucous laughter, echoing from the direction of St. James's Park. It was the kind of aggressive merriment that usually preceded trouble, the sound of men whose inhibitions had been thoroughly dissolved by alcohol and group dynamics. Through his peripheral vision, he could see 3 figures approaching the palace gates, their movements unsteady and their voices carrying across the courtyard with the volume of people who had lost all awareness of their surroundings. The leader of the group was immediately recognizable as Trouble, a thick-necked man in his 30s, wearing a football jersey that had seen better days. His face was flushed with drink and aggression, and he moved with the swagger of someone accustomed to using intimidation to get his way. His 2 companions followed in his wake like faithful disciples, feeding off his energy and amplifying his worst impulses. Thompson had encountered men like this before, in the rough neighborhoods of Helmand Province and the back alleys of Kabul. They were bullies who mistook cruelty for strength, violence for courage. They were also, in his experience, invariably cowards when faced with someone who could actually fight back. But his current position required a different kind of courage, the discipline to remain motionless while being provoked, to absorb insults and harassment without retaliation. The 3 men stumbled to a stop in front of Thompson's position, their alcohol-impaired senses apparently fascinated by the sight of a soldier standing perfectly still. The leader, whose name tag identified him as Buzzer, began the familiar routine that Thompson had endured countless times before. Well, what have we got here? Buzzer slurred, his breath carrying the sour smell of cheap beer and cigarettes. A real live toy soldier. Look at him. Lad's dressed up like he's going to a fancy dress party. His companions laughed with the kind of forced enthusiasm that drunk men use when they want to impress their friends. But Thompson could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Some part of them recognized that they were pushing boundaries that shouldn't be pushed, but alcohol and group dynamics had overwhelmed their better judgment. Thompson remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, in accordance with his training and orders. But every fiber of his being was alert, cataloging potential threats and calculating response options. His body was already shifting into combat mode, adrenaline beginning to course through his veins as muscle memory kicked in from years of high operations. From his position, Thompson could see movement in one of the upper palace windows, a small figure that he recognized as Prince George, apparently drawn by the commotion below. The sight of the young prince watching sent a chill down Thompson's spine. This was no longer just a matter of enduring harassment from drunk tourists. There was now a member of the royal family potentially at risk. The harassment escalated quickly, as it always did with men like these. Emboldened by Thompson's apparent passivity, Buzzer began poking at his chest, testing the limits of what he could get away with. His companions joined in, tugging at Thompson's tunic and making crude jokes about his uniform and his manhood. "I bet he's never been in a real fight," one of them said, a wiry man with prison tattoos covering his forearms. "Probably joined the army to avoid getting his ass kicked at school." Thompson almost smiled at the irony. If only they knew about the Taliban commanders he had tracked through the mountains of Afghanistan, or the terrorist cells he had helped dismantle in Iraq. If only they understood that the man they were tormenting had been awarded medals for valor that he could never publicly acknowledge. But the situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Through his peripheral vision, Thompson could see that Prince George was no longer at the window, and that was far more concerning than the drunk tourists in front of him. Palace security protocols were designed around predictability, around knowing exactly where every member of the royal family was at all times. The answer to George's whereabouts came moments later, when Thompson heard the sound of running footsteps on gravel. His heart nearly stopped as he realized what was happening. The young prince was racing across the courtyard, heading directly toward the confrontation at the gates. Protocol demanded that Thompson maintain his position regardless of circumstances, but every instinct screamed at him to break ranks and intercept the prince before he could reach the three drunk men. The conflict between duty and protective instinct created a tension that was almost unbearable, like being torn in two by opposing forces of equal strength. Prince George skidded to a halt between Thompson and his tormentors, his school shoes scuffing the perfectly maintained gravel of the palace courtyard. At 10 years old, he barely came up to the men's chests, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of generations of royal breeding and natural leadership. He planted his feet firmly and looked up at the three men with the kind of fearless determination that had characterized his family for centuries. "Stop that," George said, his young voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "He's protecting us, and you're being rude." The three men froze, clearly not having expected this turn of events. They had come to harass a guard who couldn't fight back, not to confront a member of the royal family. The sudden appearance of Prince George had transformed what they thought was harmless fun into a potentially serious, international incident. Thompson's mind raced as he calculated the new dynamics of the situation. His primary responsibility was now the protection of Prince George, but his orders still required him to maintain his ceremonial position. The conflict between these two imperatives created a tension that was almost physically painful. Through his earpiece, Thompson could hear the controlled chaos of the palace security system responding to the breach of protocol. Hidden cameras had undoubtedly captured George's dash across the courtyard, and armed protection officers would be moving into position even as the confrontation continued to unfold. Buzzer recovered from his initial shock with the kind of belligerent bravado that alcohol often provides. Rather than backing down in the face of royal authority, he seemed to interpret George's intervention as an escalation that demanded an even stronger response. Well, Buzzer sneered, swaying slightly as he looked down at the young prince. "Look what we've got here, lads. A little lord, come to defend his toy soldier. What are you going to do about it, princeling?" Call your nanny." His companions laughed, but there was nervousness in their laughter now. Even through their alcohol-impaired judgment, they were beginning to realize that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Harassing a guard was one thing. Confronting a member of the royal family was something else entirely. Prince George stood his ground with a kind of quiet courage that comes from good breeding and proper upbringing. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply continued to stare up at the three men with the calm confidence of someone who had never known real fear. "You should apologize," George said quietly. "He's a soldier, and soldiers deserve respect." The simple dignity of the statement hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a 10-year-old boy facing down three grown men, and somehow managing to claim the moral high ground through nothing more than good manners and quiet conviction. Thompson felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Pride at the young prince's courage and character. Terror at the potential consequences if the situation escalated further. His muscles were coiled like springs, ready to explode into action if any of the three men made a move toward George. The moment of truth came when Baza, perhaps feeling that his authority was being challenged by a child, reached out toward Prince George with the clear intention of pushing him aside. It was the kind of casual violence that bullies use to assert dominance. The assumption that size and aggression would overcome courage and principle. What happened next was a masterclass in controlled violence and split-second decision-making. The moment Baza's hand moved toward Prince George, Thompson's training and instincts took over completely. All considerations of protocol and ceremony evaporated, replaced by the primal imperative to protect the young prince at all costs. Thompson's rifle but intercepted Baza's reaching hand with surgical precision, the impact perfectly calculated to disable without causing permanent damage. The sound of the collision, a sharp crack that echoed across the courtyard, was followed immediately by Baza's howl of pain as several of his fingers bent in directions that nature never intended. But Thompson wasn't finished. Years of SAS training had taught him that in situations like this, half measures were more dangerous than decisive action. While Baza was still processing the pain in his hand, Thompson's elbow found his throat with the kind of precision that comes from thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training. Baza dropped like a stone, clutching his throat and gasping for air while his injured hand hung uselessly at his side. His companions, suddenly faced with the reality of what they were dealing with, began to back away with their hands raised in surrender. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds had demonstrated why Royal Guards were selected from the elite ranks of the British military. Thompson had neutralized the threat to Prince George while maintaining the kind of controlled response that would stand up to any investigation or inquiry. Throughout the brief confrontation, Thompson had never moved from his assigned position. His feet remained planted exactly where they had been when the trouble started, his body maintaining the rigid bearing required by centuries of military tradition. Only his arms had moved, and only when absolutely necessary to protect the prince. Prince George watched the entire sequence with wide eyes, but there was no fear in his expression, only awe and admiration for the skill and precision he had just witnessed. At 10 years old, he was already developing the kind of appreciation for military excellence that would serve him well in his future role as head of the armed forces. The third drunk, seeing his 2 companions disabled and apparently realizing that he was facing a professional soldier rather than a ceremonial figure, turned and fled toward the palace gates with the kind of speed that suggested sobriety was returning quickly. Within seconds, the courtyard was swarming with armed protection. Officers who had been monitoring the situation from hidden positions around the palace. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from extensive training and regular rehearsal, surrounding the scene while maintaining clear lines of fire and communication. Inspector Sarah Williams, the senior protection officer on duty that afternoon, approached the scene with the kind of controlled urgency that characterized all palace security operations. She had been monitoring the situation from the palace security center, watching through multiple camera angles as events unfolded in real time. "Prince George," she said gently but firmly, "we need to get you back inside the palace immediately." But George wasn't ready to leave. He was still staring up at Thompson with the kind of hero worship that 10-year-old boys reserve for their greatest idols. The guard who had seemed like a statue just moments before had transformed into something magnificent and powerful. A protector who could move with lightning speed when duty demanded it. "That was incredible," George said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "How did you do that so fast?" Thompson, who had returned to his rigid ceremonial stance the moment the threat was neutralized, allowed himself the slightest smile. It was a breach of protocol, but some moments demanded human connection over military discipline. "Training, Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for George to hear. "Lots and lots of training." Inspector Williams was already coordinating with the Metropolitan Police to ensure that the 2 injured men received medical attention and were properly processed through the criminal justice system. The incident would generate significant paperwork and require detailed statements from multiple witnesses, but the priority was getting Prince George safely back inside the palace. As the protection officers began to escort George toward the palace entrance, the young prince did something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. He stopped, turned back toward Thompson, and offered him a perfect military salute, back straight, hand positioned exactly as he had seen in countless ceremonies, eyes focused with the kind of intensity that spoke of deep respect and genuine gratitude. Thompson, bound by protocol and tradition, couldn't return the salute while on ceremonial duty, but his eyes conveyed everything that his body language couldn't: pride in the young prince's courage, gratitude for his intervention, and recognition of the mutual respect that had developed between them in those few intense moments. From an upper window of the palace, King Charles had watched the entire sequence unfold with a mixture of concern and pride. Concern for his son's safety, but pride in the character and courage that George had displayed. At 10 years old, the future king had already demonstrated the kind of moral courage that would serve him well in the decades to come. The aftermath of the incident was swift and comprehensive. The 2 injured men were taken to hospital under police escort, where they would be treated for their injuries before being formally charged with assault, breach of the peace, and several other offenses related to their behavior at the palace gates. Bazar, whose real name turned out to be Barry Mitchell, would require surgery to repair the damage to his hand and throat. He would spend the next 3 months in prison, followed by a year of community service and a lifetime ban from approaching any royal residence. His companions would receive lesser sentences, but all 3 would carry the memory of their encounter with royal justice for the rest of their lives. The incident generated intense media interest, though the palace's press office worked carefully to control the narrative. The official statement emphasized Prince George's natural protective instincts and the professional response of the Royal Guard, while downplaying the more dramatic aspects of the confrontation. But word of what had really happened spread quickly through unofficial channels. Within hours, every guard at Buckingham Palace knew about the prince who had stepped forward to defend one of their own, and the soldier who had protected him with such skill and precision. Thompson found himself something of a celebrity among his fellow guards, though he remained characteristically modest about his role in the incident. When pressed for details by his colleagues, he would simply say that he had done what any soldier would do when faced with a threat to a member of the royal family. The truth was more complex than that simple explanation suggested. Thompson's response had been shaped by years of combat experience, countless hours of training, and an instinctive understanding of when to escalate and when to hold back. He had used exactly the right amount of force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent harm, a calculation that required split-second judgment and absolute confidence in his abilities. In the days that followed, Thompson received commendations from his commanding officers and expressions of gratitude from senior members of the royal household, but the recognition that meant the most to him came from an unexpected source: a handwritten note from Prince George, thanking him for his protection and expressing admiration for his skill as a soldier. The note, written in the careful handwriting of a 10-year-old but expressing thoughts that were remarkably mature, would remain one of Thompson's most treasured possessions throughout his military career and beyond. The incident had broader implications beyond the immediate participants. Within the palace, it sparked discussions about security protocols and the appropriate balance between accessibility and protection. The fact that Prince George had been able to leave the family quarters and reach the courtyard without being intercepted suggested gaps in the security arrangements that needed to be addressed. But there was also recognition that the young prince's intervention had revealed something important about his character: a willingness to stand up for others, even in the face of personal risk. These were qualities that would serve him well in his future role as king. and palace officials were careful to nurture, rather than discourage such instincts. King Charles had a long conversation with his son about the incident, discussing both the courage George had shown and the importance of working within established security protocols. It was a delicate balance, encouraging the kind of moral leadership that the monarchy required, while ensuring that such leadership didn't compromise personal safety. The conversation took place in the king's private study, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own challenges and crises. Charles spoke to his son about the weight of responsibility that came with royal birth, the expectation that members of the royal family would always do the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous. "What you did today showed real courage," Charles told his son. But courage isn't just about being brave in the moment, it's also about understanding the consequences of our actions and making sure we don't put others at risk unnecessarily. George listened with the kind of serious attention that suggested he understood the importance of what his father was saying. At 10 years old, he was already beginning to grasp the complex relationship between privilege and responsibility that would define his entire life. The incident also had an impact on Thompson's career trajectory. His commanding officers recognized that his combination of combat experience and ceremonial skills made him ideal for certain specialized roles within the Royal Guard. Within 6 months, he would be promoted to sergeant and assigned to the personal protection detail for senior members of the royal family. It was a position that would allow him to use both his military training and his understanding of royal protocol, serving as a bridge between the ceremonial aspects of palace life and the very real security challenges that the royal family faced in an increasingly complex world. The story of Prince George's intervention and Thompson's response became legend within military circles, though the full details were never made public. It was the kind of story that soldiers told each other over drinks, a reminder of what it meant to serve with honor and distinction. In the months that followed, Thompson would often catch glimpses of Prince George during palace ceremonies and official functions. The young prince would sometimes offer him a subtle nod of recognition, an acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged during those few intense moments in the courtyard. For George, the incident became a formative experience that would influence his understanding of leadership and responsibility. He had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required personal courage, but he had also learned the importance of having people around you who could be trusted to handle situations that were beyond your capabilities. The handwritten note that George had sent to Thompson became the first of many personal communications between members of the royal family and the soldiers who protected them. It established a precedent for direct personal acknowledgement of exceptional service that would continue throughout George's life. Years later, when George was old enough to understand the full implications of what had happened that day, he would seek out Thompson for a longer conversation about military service and the responsibilities of leadership. That conversation would take place in the same palace courtyard where they had first encountered each other, but under very different circumstances. By then, Thompson would be a senior non-commissioned officer with decades of experience in both combat and ceremonial roles. George would be a young man preparing for his future role as king, studying at university and beginning to take on more formal royal duties. The conversation would range over many topics: the nature of duty, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the complex relationship between tradition and change that defines modern monarchy. But it would always come back to that afternoon when a 10-year-old boy had stepped forward to defend a soldier, and that soldier had proven worthy of such faith. Thompson would retire from active military service with the rank of warrant officer, having served with distinction in both operational and ceremonial roles. His final assignment would be as a senior instructor at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where he would train the next generation of British officers in the principles of leadership, courage, and service. The legacy of that afternoon extended far beyond the immediate participants. The story became part of the oral tradition of the Royal Guard, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next as an example of what it meant to serve with honor and distinction. New recruits to the Royal Guard would hear the story during their training, learning about the importance of remaining alert and ready for action, even during ceremonial duties. They would study the tactical decisions that Thompson had made, understanding how years of training and experience had prepared him for that moment of crisis. The incident also influenced changes in royal protection protocols, leading to enhanced coordination between ceremonial guards and armed protection officers. The lessons learned that day would help prevent similar situations in the future, ensuring that members of the royal family were better protected while still maintaining the accessibility that was so important to the modern monarchy. Prince George would grow up to become one of the most popular members of the royal family, known for his combination of traditional values and modern sensibility. His willingness to engage with people from all walks of life and his genuine interest in military affairs would make him a natural leader and an effective representative of British values around the world. The moment when he stepped forward to defend Thompson would be remembered as one of the defining incidents of his youth, a demonstration of the character and courage that would serve him throughout his life. It would be referenced in countless speeches and articles about his development as a future king, cited as evidence of his natural leadership abilities and his deep respect for those who had served their country. Thompson would remain in touch with the royal family throughout his life, attending special ceremonies and occasionally being called upon to share his experiences with younger members of the family, who were beginning their own journeys of service and responsibility. The Union Jack flag that Prince George had worn on his school blazer that day would be carefully preserved, eventually taking its place in the royal archives alongside other artifacts that told the story of the modern monarchy. It would serve as a tangible reminder of a moment when courage and duty intersected in the most dramatic way possible. In the end, the story of that afternoon at Buckingham Palace became more than just an account of a confrontation between drunk tourists and a royal guard. It became a parable about the nature of true leadership, the willingness to step forward when others need protection, the importance of having people around you who are worthy of trust, and the understanding that real courage often reveals itself in the smallest gestures and the quietest moments. The 10-year-old boy who ran across that courtyard to defend a soldier would one day become king. The soldier who protected him with such skill and precision would carry the memory of that moment throughout his life, a reminder of why he had chosen to serve and what that service truly meant. Together, they had created a moment that embodied the best traditions of British courage, duty, and honor, values that would continue to inspire future generations long after the participants had passed into history. The story would be told and retold, each time reinforcing the timeless truth that real strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And in a world that often seemed to celebrate the loud and the violent, it would serve as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of those who choose to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost.